Ladies and gentlemen, staff and students of the College and the Department of Social Sciences, students from second level, you're very welcome, and members of the public, thank you very much for coming today. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speaker, Father Peter McVerry. He doesn't need any introduction. You're all very familiar with Father Peter, and I know over the next few days, given our current weather conditions, I think you're going to be seeing rather a lot of Father Peter on the TV. So maybe he's come down to kind of get a little break from all the demand that's going to be placed on him over the next few days. I hope you enjoy the lecture. Afterwards, Pat will just lead some questions and answers. So I know we're looking forward to a very lively and interesting conversation afterwards as well. So I'd like you to welcome Father Peter, and we very much look forward to his talk. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And what I want to talk about really is homelessness and housing, obviously. But homelessness is only the most visible and extreme consequence of a dysfunctional housing system. And rough sleeping is only the most visible and extreme consequence of homelessness. So when we talk about homelessness, we have to go back behind it to look at housing. And obviously it sounds like a cliche, but it keeps getting forgotten. The solution to homelessness is to give people a home. So we have to look at the housing system and the failures within the housing system. You'll read frequently in the media about the number of people who are homeless. And the current figure they give is 9,000, roughly 9,000. But that's not the number of people who are homeless. The 9,000 refers to the number of people who are using emergency homeless accommodation. But there are many others who will not use emergency homeless accommodation because much of it is pretty awful. It's dormitory style accommodation. You could be drug-free, but you're sharing a room with active drug users. People complain to me about being assaulted, about having their belongings stolen. So many people will not go into emergency homeless accommodation. So the 9,000 people does not include those who are sleeping rough, those who are sleeping in their cars. In Ballymun, where I live, there are 3 people sleeping in their cars in the car park. On Christmas Day, I brought them out 3 dinners. One of the cars was missing. I said, "Where's this guy?" He's gone to work, they said. And that reflects the change in the nature of homelessness, that many homeless people today have got jobs, but their income does not allow them to pay the inflated rents that are being asked. The 9,000 figure doesn't include those who are sofa surfing. It doesn't include those women and children in domestic refuges. And it doesn't include those women and children who sought a place in a domestic refuge but couldn't get in and had to go back home again to a violent home. It doesn't include refugees, 500 of them, who have been granted refugee status but can't move out of direct provision because there's no accommodation available to them. So I would guesstimate that there are probably closer to 15,000 people who are actually without a home in this country. As well as those 15,000, there are a lot of people living in overcrowded households. Maybe they have lost their private rented accommodation for a variety of reasons that I'll come to, and they moved in with their parents. And you could have 3 generations of the same family, or even 4 generations living in a 3-bedroom house. There's also those who are living in very poor quality rented accommodation. And we've seen a primetime programme on that. But there are many, many people living in poor quality rented accommodation who can't complain. Because if they complain, they're going to get booted out and they're going to become homeless. There's also all those adults, the 20s and 30s and 40-somethings who are still living with their parents because they cannot afford to move out. There are those who are in private rented accommodation and paying more than 50% of their income towards the rent and are worried sick as to when the landlord is going to come along and increase the rent to a level they can no longer afford. And there are those 50,000 households in mortgage arrears who are worried sick as to when a letter's going to come through the letterbox saying the banks are seeking repossession. So all in all, apart from the 9,000 or 15,000, depending on how you count them, people who are homeless, I would guesstimate that there are 500,000 people in this country who are either homeless, living in unacceptable accommodation, or whose accommodation is causing them severe stress. Maybe 500, another commentator suggested it was probably closer to 800,000. 500,000 would be 1 in 10 of the Irish population. So we have a crisis. And it's going to get worse. There are 47,000 mortgages in arrears of more than 2 years. Most of those are unrepayable. And many of those are going to be repossessed. We've seen it in the newspapers recently. PTSB are planning to sell 18,000 mortgages to the vulture funds. And Ulster Bank have come in and said, we're going to do the same with 6,000 mortgages. So there are many people who are in mortgage arrears who are likely to lose their homes, and some of them will end up homeless if they can't go back to their parents or find someone to take them in. Also with Brexit. With Brexit, the government are hoping for thousands of employees to relocate to Ireland, and they're going to have to find accommodation. And they're going to find accommodation in the already overstretched private rented sector. They can afford, they're on good salaries, they can afford rents of €2,000 a month. The rents are going to skyrocket again, and low-income families are going to be thrown out. And apart from that, when Brexit occurs, there are many EU nationals who might have gone to England or Britain, but may now not be able to get in. Or if they do get in, may not feel welcome. And they may decide to come to Ireland, and they'll be looking for accommodation in the private rented sector. So we have a huge problem that, in the absence of a change of policy, is, in my view, very likely to get worse. We have a dysfunctional housing system. In a housing system, there's 3 sectors. There's private housing, there's private rented, and there is social housing, or what we used to call council housing. All 3 sectors are in crisis at the same time. There's a dire shortage of private housing. The experts reckon, depending on who you listen to, but all the experts would agree, except for Conor Skehan of the Housing Agency. We'll come back to him in a minute. But all the experts would agree that between 30 and 50,000 private houses need to be built every year just to keep up with the demand, just to keep up with the demographics and people returning to Ireland. How many did we build last year? Less than 10,000. So there's a dire shortage of private housing. And those who can't get into private housing, where are they going to find accommodation? They're going into the private rented sector. And there's a dire shortage of social housing. In 1975, this country built 8,500 social houses, or council houses. In 1985, and we had a recession in the 80s, we still built 6,900 social houses. In 2015, this country built 75 social houses. And that's the core of the problem. We stopped building social housing. And so those who can't get social housing, where are they going to find accommodation? In the private rented sector. And so the demand in the private rented sector far exceeds supply, and so the rents are going through the roof. If one of our homeless guys or anybody goes to look at an apartment or a house to rent, there'll be 30 other people outside the door waiting to view it. And because of that pressure, maybe the apartment is renting for, say, €1,200 a month. somebody in the queue who has a good job will go to the landlord and say, look, I'm desperate, I'll give you 1,400 euros. So if you're on a low income, you get squeezed out. So we have this, and the problem with the housing system is all three sectors are in crisis at exactly the same time. Normally in a functioning housing system, if one sector falls into crisis, the other two sectors can compensate. But today we have all three sectors in crisis at the same time. What's the failure in government strategy? Government have produced a document, Rebuilding Ireland, the Housing and Homeless Strategy. And for me, it contains two major failures. The first is the continued reliance on the private rented sector to provide social housing. This began about 20 years ago, and it began during the Celtic Tiger years. It wasn't a question of money, but the reduction in the building of social housing was created by an ideological decision that social housing should be provided by the market. And that meant particularly by the private rented sector. And so the government started giving subsidies, originally a rent supplement, now more usually the HAP payment, the housing assistance payment. Government started giving subsidies to people to rent in the private rented sector, and as I say, they reduced the building of social housing. The reduction in the building of social housing is the cause of homelessness today, because if somebody gets evicted from the private rented sector, normally in the past they would have moved into social housing or they would have gone on a waiting list. Today there isn't any social housing to move into, and they end up homeless. So the government continue today to rely on the private rented sector to solve the homeless housing crisis. And in the Rebuilding Ireland strategy, 3 out of 4 of people who are homeless and 3 out of 4 households on the social housing waiting list are to exit the waiting list or homelessness into the private rented sector. That it cannot work. That has been the cause of the problem. It cannot be the solution to the problem. The private rented sector is already overstretched, and that reliance on the private rented sector is one of the big failures in Rebuilding Ireland. If you look at the report on housing for 2016, the government will say we moved 17,000 people on the social housing waiting list into social housing. Sounds fantastic. How many social houses did we build in 2016? 578. Now also local authorities bought some houses. They brought some houses back into use that were lying empty. But the vast, vast majority of those 17,000 were moved into the private rented sector. And some of them have already lost their private rented accommodation in the private rented sector. This reliance on the private rented sector, not only is it a failure, but it's a very expensive failure. If you look at the budget for this year, the government have allocated €2 million per day to private landlords to provide social housing. And over the 5-year plan of Rebuilding Ireland, that works out at €3.75 billion being given to private landlords to provide social housing, and that €3.75 billion will not create one single extra house. So, first flaw, fundamental flaw in Rebuilding Ireland is the continued reliance on the private sector. The second fundamental flaw, it seems to me, in Rebuilding Ireland, there is very little in it to prevent people and households becoming homeless. Where are people, where are newly homeless people coming from? The majority are coming from the private rented sector. They're being evicted for one of a number of reasons. Either the banks have repossessed the house because the landlord was unable to pay the mortgage, or the rents have gone to a level they can no longer afford, or the landlord says he's selling the house, you have to move out, or the landlord says, I need the house for my granny who's coming back from Canada, you're going to have to move out. So people are being evicted from the private rented sector, and there is almost nothing in Rebuilding Ireland to prevent that. The only one measure that was taken was that in the rent control zones like Dublin and Cork and so forth, landlords can only raise the rent by 4% per year for the next 3 years. Useless. Whose wages are going to go up by 12% over the next 3 years? Unless you're an Aer Lingus pilot, they're getting 11%. Unless you're an Aer Lingus pilot, nobody's wages are going to go up by 12%. And so even that is not going to prevent some families from losing their accommodation. And many landlords are ignoring that, and they're putting the rent up. And what happens to them? Nothing. Why not? Because nobody knows about it. If the landlord puts the rent up by more than 4%, it's up to the tenant to complain. And of course the tenant won't complain because they're afraid they're going to be kicked out and made homeless. So there is nothing in Rebuilding Ireland really to prevent people coming into homelessness. So there's two problems we have at the moment, and I'll come to solutions in a minute. There's two problems. One is housing all those people who are homeless and all those people who are on the social housing waiting list. And the other is preventing more and more people coming into homelessness. In fairness to the government and to the local authorities, they are trying to house people as rapidly as possible. But the number coming into homelessness is far greater than the number who are exiting homelessness. And as I said to the minister, unless you prevent people coming into homelessness, trying to house the people who are homeless is like trying to empty the water out of the bathtub with the tap still full on. You got to start preventing. How would you house people who are currently homeless and on the social housing waiting list? Well, I think there's a number of. First of all, the overall solution has got to be we've got to go back to building social housing. That is the only long-term solution. The local authorities in this country own 1,200 hectares of land. It's fully serviced and with planning permission for residential accommodation. Those 1,200 hectares could build 40,000 houses. What are the government going to do? They're probably going to do what they've always done. They're going to give that to a private developer to develop private housing and give the government back 20% in social housing. A total waste of good government land that could have provided social housing. So one of the things I'd be saying is, public land for public housing, not for private housing. Build public housing on publicly owned land. Government is very anxious that we shouldn't create big social housing ghettos. I don't accept that. I don't think social housing in itself is a problem. I think the problems that arose in the past with social housing was where social housing was provided with no services. I think that was the problem. But anyway, government want to ensure we don't have big mono units of social housing. Of those 40,000 houses that could be built on publicly owned land, you could have some social housing, you could have some affordable housing, you could have some cooperative housing, you could have some for students, and you get your integrated mix. Actually, the government 2 years ago promised to develop an affordable housing strategy, and we haven't seen it yet. What would an affordable housing strategy do? Well, there's this group of households whose income is too low for them to be able to get a mortgage. To get a mortgage now today, you need an income of about 75,000 euros. And only 1 in 3 households in Ireland have an income of 75,000 euros. So there are those households whose income is too low to get a mortgage, but it's too high to qualify for social housing. And they're the squeezed middle. They're in private rented accommodation because they can't get a mortgage. And if the rents go up to, and many of them paying more than 50% of their income to try and keep their house, if the rents go up, they'll get kicked out. And so the government promised for that group an affordable housing strategy and an affordable rental strategy. And we haven't seen either of them yet. Everywhere you go, you see empty houses and apartments, boarded up, permanently empty. We're not talking here about holiday homes or homes that may be used for a couple of weekends a year. In the census of 2016, they identified 186,000 permanently empty, boarded up houses and apartments. Now, some of those will already have been brought back into use since the census. Some of them may not be suitable. They may be in areas where nobody wants to live, like County Leitrim. I hope nobody here from County Leitrim. Or there may be problems with the houses. Some of them will be tied up in the Fair Deal scheme for elderly people who are in nursing homes, and they're not available to be sold. But many of them would be suitable. And I would advocate compulsory purchase orders. There is a government grant to owners of those properties to bring them back into use. But in the 12 months since that grant was offered, only about 100 owners have accepted the grant and brought those properties back into use. I would say to the owners of those properties, you either bring them back into use or we compulsorily purchase them. And that would solve the problem. It's probably, certainly, even if only half of those were available, you're talking of 90,000 units. That would make a huge difference to the social housing waiting lists. So I think we could house, and very rapidly we could house, those who are homeless and on the social housing waiting list. Actually, the Louth County Council are leading the way in this. They have taken, as far as I know to date, about 80 compulsory purchase orders. And when the owners have gone to the courts to argue that this was interference with private property, they've only lost 2 of the cases. So there is a precedent there. Louth County Council are showing the other councils the way, and they should be following. How do you prevent more and more people becoming homeless? I would legislate to make it illegal to evict people onto the streets, whether it's banks, vulture funds, or landlords. I would make it illegal to evict people onto the streets. Except in specific circumstances, such as somebody doesn't bother paying the rent to the landlord at all, come across that situation, and it takes the landlord 18 months to get them out. Somebody who doesn't bother paying the rent, or somebody who's engaged in antisocial behaviour or drug dealing from the house, of course there should be a fast-track process through the courts to get those people out. But in the normal course of events, it should be illegal to evict people onto the streets. And a bill was presented to the Dáil about 6 months ago to do that, and the government voted against it, and it failed. During the famine years, we evicted families onto the street because they couldn't pay the rent. Today, we're doing exactly the same. We are the 14th wealthiest country in the world. We have the fastest growing economy in the EU. And the government keep reminding us that we're in the 5th year of economic recovery. And we still have growing numbers of people who are homeless. And we cannot even provide decent accommodation for, as I say, up to or over 500,000 people in this country. The other thing, because many mortgages are in arrears, there is a scheme called the Mortgage to Rent scheme, whereby the bank would sell the house to a local authority or to a registered charity, and the occupants would be allowed to stay in, and they would now pay rent to that local authority or to the to the charity. And that scheme has been in there for about 5 years. But it's extremely limited. The value of the house has to be below a certain level. The income of the occupants has to be below a certain level. It's extremely limited, and only a few hundred cases. Mortgage arrears cases have been resolved with the mortgage to rent. I would make the mortgage to rent obligatory on the banks. That you shouldn't evict people. You should give the house, sell the house to a local authority or a registered charity and leave the occupants in. So there are some of the measures that they're radical measures, but they're measures that I believe have got to be taken. I think we need to declare a housing homeless emergency in this country. If we had a tsunami in the morning and 9,000 people were made homeless, we would declare an emergency, and we would get everybody around the table, and we would work to try and prevent those 9,000 people ending up on the street. We need to declare a housing and homeless emergency, and we need to respond with emergency measures that in normal course of events we wouldn't perhaps contemplate. Do I have any confidence in the government? No. I've given up on the government. Some of the statements, you get a flavour of what the government's thinking is in the statements. First of all, the Taoiseach last year talked about those on the social housing waiting list. Well, they are people who already have houses or apartments, he said, and they just want different houses and apartments. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence that the Taoiseach believes that this is a crisis. He has talked about his priority is those who get up early in the morning. And as somebody wrote to the paper and said, does that include the homeless? Who have to get up early in the morning. He talks about his priority for the next 3 budgets are tax cuts. And he talked about the fact that homelessness in Ireland is not unusual compared to other European countries. There is quite a conscious effort to downplay the homeless housing crisis in Ireland. He said, compared to other countries, our homeless crisis is fairly normal and indeed is less than that in other countries. Where did he get that from? He got it from an OECD report, which looked at homelessness in 30 countries. But the OECD report states quite explicitly that you cannot use these figures to compare homelessness between countries, because different countries use different definitions of homelessness. In particular, 15 of the 30 countries included in their homeless figures those adults still living with their parents who couldn't find suitable accommodation. Now, if we included those adults who are still living with their parents because they can't afford to move out, we wouldn't be talking about 9,000 homeless people. We'd be talking about 90,000 homeless people. The census in 2016 again identified 500,000 adults still living with their parents. Now, many of them probably quite happily living with their parents. We don't know what the parents think, but they're quite happy living with the parents. And many of them choose to live with the parents, but an unknown number are stuck there because they cannot afford to move out. Then Damien English came in with a statement similar, saying, yeah, it's true. Our homeless figures are quite normal compared to other countries. And he was taking his figures from a Fianza report. A Fianza report is a European report on homelessness. And again, it says in the title of the report, non-comparable figures. You cannot use these figures to compare. Again, different countries use different definitions, and the figures for homelessness came from different years. Some countries were reporting homelessness from 2011. Other countries, 2012 or 13. The Irish figures were for 2016. So Fake news, yeah, fake news. The government are trying to downplay this problem of homelessness because they know it's their Achilles heel. They know that the electorate will be partly judging them on the way in which they address this housing crisis. The right to housing, and I'll finish on this. A lot of voluntary bodies are very anxious to get the right to housing into the Constitution. We have a right to education in the Constitution, and that means that every child has a right to education. And if they don't get that right, if they're not given that right for whatever reason, they can go to the courts. And the courts will order the government to ensure that this particular child gets an education. We believe that if we had the right to housing in the Constitution, like 80 other countries around the world, it would make a huge difference. What would it do? It doesn't mean that the following day everybody can go to the courts and say, I want a house. But it would put pressure on government to progressively realise the right to housing for everyone in this country. It would put pressure on government to produce policies that were actually moving in that direction. And it would require the government to give timelines as to when they're going to achieve this objective of giving everybody their right to housing. So we're very anxious to get that in. The government are totally resistant. We have signed up to a couple of international treaties. We've signed up to the UN Convention on Human Rights, which declares housing to be a fundamental right. We've signed up to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and we've signed up to the revised European Social Charter of the Council of Europe, all of which define housing as a fundamental human right. And yet, since the late 1990s, governments have produced 10 reports, 10 policies and or statements on housing and homelessness, and not one of them refers to housing as a fundamental human right. If you read Rebuilding Ireland, the current policy, the government declare housing to be an important human need, but not a fundamental human right. And that is that's quite deliberate, because if you include that as a fundamental human right, then the courts will have a say on what the government is doing, and the government don't want to give the courts a say, and they've said that quite explicitly. They don't want unelected judges to tell the government how to spend their money. But it's very important we get that into the Constitution. Constitutional Convention a couple of years ago voted on whether that should be in the Constitution, and overwhelmingly they voted in favour of putting that into the Constitution. What overall is the problem? The problem overall is that housing has become a commodity to be bought and sold for profit. And this is a worldwide phenomenon, not just an Irish phenomenon. The financialization of housing. If you have $500,000 under the mattress, probably not many of you have, but if you have €500,000 under the mattress, you put that in a bank, you'll be lucky to get €5,000 interest at the end of the year. House inflation is 8 to 10% a year. You buy a house for €500,000 and you sell it after 12 months, you'll make a profit of about €50,000. So housing has become the most profitable investment today that people can make. And so much of the housing that is being built is being bought up by investors who are simply there to make a profit. It's being bought up. Half of all the housing being built is being bought for cash, not for mortgages. It's being bought for cash. And buying it for cash is predominantly wealthy people who are buying it as an investment. Some of them will just leave it lying empty for 2 or 3 years, and then they will come in and they'll cash in and sell it for a very, very big profit. And that fundamentally is the problem we have with our housing system. Housing has become a commodity to be bought and sold, and not as a home for people to live in. And again, government policy has facilitated that. When the big foreign investment funds came in and bought up housing in Ireland, many of them were given charitable status. They didn't have to pay corporation tax. Those who came in between 2011 and 2014 and bought up property are exempt from capital gains tax. Incentives were given to foreign investors to come in and buy up this property at a cheap price in order to sell it again a few years later at a very substantial profit, and there was no tax to be paid on it. So government policies have facilitated the commodification of housing, and we need to reverse that. I'd have a 95% capital gains tax on investors who buy houses. And if they sell them a couple of years later, they have to pay a 95% tax on the profits. Nobody's going to do that. But that would get rid of the investors out of the market and allow houses to be bought by people who need them as homes. So overall, I think we have a huge problem, a huge crisis, an emergency which is not being recognised. And the government mantra, again and again and again, is rebuilding Ireland is working. But you've got to give it time. Amartya Sen, who's a famous economist, he said, patience is a form of despair disguised as virtue. We have been patient long enough. Thank you very much.
I'm just conscious of the evening that's in it, so we might just take a few questions from Peter, again, as usual. He was, very informative and very, very thought-provoking. So maybe questions, lads. Is there any questions out there? I hate these pregnant pauses, lads. Sorry.
Peter, I am kind of interested in the whole concept of the difference between, the urban environment and the rural environment. I'm from Dublin myself, and I travel up and down the motorway, and it's like I'm leaving a city bursting at the seams that can't just another human being. There isn't room for one. And then you go beyond Barack Obama Plaza, and I'm isolated. I'm driving home on my own virtually into the dark night. The role of rural resettlement, that was a very popular thing in the 70s and 80s. I know it's lost, it's gone out of fashion. But is there a role for that again? Because there are communities in the West and South West dying for the want of, young people and regeneration. And it would seem that it's like we're a country of two halves, and it's a very divided world. And is there any way through this crisis that something could come out of that with respect to rebuilding?
Yeah, we are a divided country, and people in the rural areas will talk about that. Everything is Dublin focused. All the policies are Dublin focused. Rural resettlement has been in existence for about 20 years, but in the last 8 or 9 years, the funding was withdrawn, and they had to lose their staff, and the whole thing has more or less died. There is a role for moving families down the country. I know some families who did move down the country under rural resettlement very successfully. Many didn't. Many came down, found it too lonely, and wanted to go back again. So I think there is a role there for rural resettlement for a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of families who are on the waiting list, or families who are homeless.
Yeah, and I think the ultimate regeneration policy is employment. It's the lack of employment. There just isn't enough work here. And to try and get the government to realise that there are people here who need work as well. Yeah. And so it's kind of a two-pronged thing. Thanks.
Yeah, rural resettlement, the success of rural resettlement was they had staff who would help people to integrate. And once they lost those staff because of funding, you can't just bring somebody down and give them the key of a house in the middle of nowhere with knowing nobody. So you need that support structure.
I suppose my question, you've talked about how dysfunctional the whole housing system is, and even the charities, I suppose, working in the area so dysfunctional as well. And kind of government's push for kind of laissez-faire economic policies. But what power do you feel people will have? You know, collectively, I suppose water, and you know, the masses sending and you know, taking a stand. And for housing, that really hasn't happened.
No.
I know, I suppose, our society at times can be very individualised, and that kind of solidarity and, you know, kind of your metal to your fellow person is kind of very much broken and fragmented, especially in some communities.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. We are a very individualistic. We've built a value of individualism into our society. I think that was accentuated during the Celtic Tiger years. You were told you're on your own, go out there, make it while the going's good. Nobody's going to give you a lift up. You have to do this yourself. The water charges, people power is very powerful, and the water charges marches showed that. But water charges affected everybody, whereas housing and homelessness doesn't. Most people have their house, or they're happily in private rented accommodation with a very good landlord, and so the issue doesn't directly touch them. A lot of the charities, a lot of the housing agencies in Dublin call for a march, and there is a big march on the 4th of, I think it's the 4th of April, the 7th of April, in Dublin to demand a change in homeless and housing policies. I've always been against that.
Yeah, even that has been tried to, you know, their political slant of Labour is being placed on that.
Yeah, but I've been against it, because I'm saying, you're thinking of Irish Water, 100,000 people came out, government did a U-turn. If you have a march for housing and homelessness, you'll be lucky to get 10,000 people out. And if you get 10,000 people out, you're sending the wrong message to government. You're sending the message that really the public don't really care. So I've been opposed to it. Now, there is a march going ahead, as I say, at the beginning of April. We'll wait and see how many turn up for that. But I would be very worried, in fact, that that march will not attract a big crowd. And therefore it is going to be counterproductive. Yeah. But people power, if we could get everybody out. What's going to happen is there are a lot of families now, as I say, whose older children in their 20s, 30s and 40s can't move out. They should have an interest in putting pressure on government to produce better housing policies. There are people living in, as I say, run-down private rented accommodation. They should be out putting pressure. Those who are in mortgage arrears and stressed out should be out. But getting people who are in dire circumstances out to march is very difficult, because they're just trying to survive. And all their energy is going into trying to survive, and they don't have the energy to go out and march for a change in government policy.
Good evening, Father. Thanks very much for your lecture. My name is Bridget Quilligan. I'm a Traveller woman, and I work with the local Traveller project, Kerry Traveller Health Community and Development Project. Father, I suppose I have an observation and questions for you, if you don't mind. The first was, I agree with your comment around the government's ability and capacity to deal with the housing and homelessness crisis. Definitely, I would feel the same way myself. I would maybe go a step further and wonder, what would your opinion be in taking away that remit from local government? Would you?
I think there's a model there in the north of Ireland. North of Ireland, housing is under the control of the housing executive, and it's independent of politics. And the reason for that in the north of Ireland was the political parties didn't trust the nationalists or the unionists to be Minister for Housing, for fear they would discriminate in favour of their own community. So they set up this independent body, the Housing Executive, and I would be all in favour of exploring that as a way forward. One of the big obstacles, if there is a piece of land, you want to build social housing on it, the whole area is going to be up in arms complaining and protesting and picketing. And they're the people who are going to have to elect the the councillors at the next election, and the councillors don't want to become unpopular, and so they will backtrack on providing social housing. So I would be very, very open to at least exploring the option of having a housing executive which was independent of politics. I was up in Derry last year. Last year, we built 578 social houses in this whole country. I was up in Derry, and in Derry, on the outskirts of Derry, the housing executive, Derry has a population equivalent to 2% of the Republic of Ireland. And on the outskirts of Derry, the housing executive were building 1,000 social houses. I think that's where we need to go to.
Thank you. And finally, I'm going to be killed here, but just in terms of solutions, we work on accommodation. As you know, most of our accommodation budget is sent back annually to the state, despite our high need. In Kerry alone, now we did spend our budget, but in Kerry alone we have unprecedented level of people becoming homeless, travellers becoming homeless. So is there any solutions you would have for us as a local organisation in trying to tackle this crisis? Thank you.
I should have mentioned travellers. Obviously, travellers are a big group of people who are homeless. Many travellers living on the side of the road. Many travellers living in what are called temporary halting sites, temporary accommodation. They could be living there for 15 years, but because they're temporary, the local authority doesn't do any repairs, and so they fall into disrepair. But the travellers have to continue living there. When the recession came, the budget for traveller accommodation was reduced by 90%. And even today, with the remaining 10% that's still being allocated, many local authorities are giving half of that back to the government. They haven't spent it. So it's an absolute scandal. I think this is an area where there is a huge amount of prejudice. I would think the churches have a great role to play in providing for traveller accommodation. I have publicly called for all bishops to make a commitment that within 12 months there would be no traveller families living on the side of the road in their diocese. And that means they've got to lobby, they've got to go to the local authorities, maybe they have to provide some land where travellers, but I think we need that focus. And that was my mistake. I've talked here for the last 40 minutes about homelessness and housing, and I never mentioned the travellers. Travellers get left out. They get left out all the time, and I think we need to refocus on housing travellers as a specific group. Otherwise, they do just fall through down to the bottom of the priority list. So that's where I think the churches can come in. They have got to convince their parishioners, they've got to convince the people, the members of the church, that, welcoming travellers and having travellers living close to you is an important Christian requirement. And that there's nothing to be scared of with travellers. You could have the Kinahans living beside you, and there's nothing you can do about it now. We need to be able to reach out to travellers, and we need to respect travellers, and we need not to fear travellers. Of course, some travellers are going out and going down to rural areas and robbing people, but some of the settled community are doing that exactly the same, and yet we stigmatise travellers for that. So, yeah, I think it's one of the areas I would like to see is getting the churches on board.
I wonder if we perhaps are drawing the wrong lesson from the water issue, Irish water. The assumption that involved genuine social solidarity. Another contributor mentioned that Ireland is a very individualist society and has become very individualist. It is possible that Irish water and the degree of public outcry emanated from each individual believing they'd end up paying more for water. Now, I think there's a real risk that, particularly referring to the word homelessness, that it is seen as, by most, the issue is seen as referring to those who are on the streets, referring to those who are in emergency accommodation, and somehow they're not us. They're not part and parcel or relevant to the broad swathes of the middle classes who vote governments in and out.
Yeah.
And governments are responsive to whatever gets them voted in and out. If the issue was broadened sufficiently and campaigned on a sufficiently broad basis, surely it's in the interests of virtually every member of the broad swathe of the middle classes to end the situation where there is a gross shortage of houses, whether to rent or to buy, they're ridiculously overpriced, and produce a situation where we have a reasonably functioning housing market. And it's not just, it's in their own self-interest to do so. There may be a small proportion of people who, because they have ready cash, can capitalize on this to make extraordinary profits, but most people can't. And if the campaign was a housing market campaign, focusing on the issues that most appeal to people's self-interest, their amount of their income they're forced to expend on housing, on the mortgage repayments, on rental and so on. I wonder if greater success might not be had, and if that's not the solution to this, to whip up the degree of public interest and support for change that's necessary.
I would absolutely agree with you. The public perception of homelessness is shaped by those homeless people you see on the street with a drink problem, a drug problem, begging, sleeping rough, but they're in a minority. We have homeless young people studying in UCD. We have homeless young people studying in Trinity College. We have homeless young people who became electricians and carpenters and bricklayers. 2 of our 17-year-old homeless young people are just back from California. They were there on a sports scholarship trial, but they're invisible. They are, you could be sitting in a lecture room in Trinity College, nobody knows you're homeless. And so the only homeless people who are visible are the ones with the drink and the drug problem, and that shapes the public's perception of homelessness. And as long as that is the public perception of homelessness, then there will be very little empathy or pressure to try and address the problem. So I do think we have to expand the understanding of homelessness. I think that may be happening. It may be happening because, as I say, there are many adults who are living with their parents who can't move out. It may happen when a lot of these mortgages in serious arrears are repossessed. Every single parish in Ireland, unless the government changes its policy to a mortgage to rent scheme, unless every single parish in Ireland is going to see people becoming homeless, and middle class people becoming homeless. People on good incomes, but they can't afford to pay the mortgage, or they can't afford to pay the rent. So unfortunately, as the problem of homelessness expands into other social groups, it may put pressure on people to take action, but a lot of people are going to have to suffer until that happens. But as I say, you know, in the census, people say to me, why don't homeless people get up and go out and get work, get a job? In the census in 2016, 31% of homeless people who were eligible to work were actually working, but their income didn't allow them to pay for their own accommodation. So the majority of homeless people today have only one problem. It's not drink, it's not drugs, it's not mental health. The only problem they have is they don't have the money to pay for their own accommodation. And I think we need to change the perception of homelessness to include that large group of people. So I absolutely agree with everything you said. Yeah.
Folks, I think we better wind up because I'm conscious. Just before we go, just a couple of just things. Number one, can I just thank you all for attending here in such large numbers. We were getting a bit worried because we got reports that there was a mass exodus from the campus when the word went out that the campus is closed tomorrow and Friday. So can I just thank you all for being here. Most of all, would you please stay safe over the next few days? That's the most important thing. Thanks for being here. And most of all, can I just thank Peter, who defied the beast from the east and came down to us in the West, and as usual gave us a fantastic lecture, very informative, stimulating and thought-provoking. So maybe you might just show Peter your picture. Thank you.